Exceeding Expectations, episode 28. Welcome to Exceeding Expectations, the show where our guests give you ideas on how you can give a better experience to your customers. And you may hear someone from a very different industry and they talk about something that is very different to what you do, but maybe with some tweaks you can make it work in what it is that you do. Today's guest is Marion Ellis. And if you ever bought a house, or especially if you've remortgaged, I think the whole surveying process, she's a surveyor, that's her background, is something we give very little thought to, and we just want the survey to come back as quickly as possible with the figure that we need to get that remortgage or whatever it might be, and we don't really give much thought to what's actually involved somehow, or maybe it's just me. So Marion's going to tell us about the complaint handling awards and how she trains new surveyors and get them to think about things from the consumer point of view. So that's this week's episode with Marion Ellis. Here we are for another edition of Exceeding Expectations, and my guest today is Marion Ellis. How are you, Marion?
I'm great, thank you. How are you, Tony?
I'm very well, thank you. So we were just having a brief chat before we started recording, and you were telling me a few things about yourself and so on. And one of the things I found quite interesting, you told me you recently judged the UK Complaint Handling Awards.
Yes,
what on earth
I
is
did.
that?
I know. Can you believe that there's an award for good complaint handling? It's the first time that I've done it. I've judged at the UK Customer Experience Awards a couple of times, and they asked me if I was interested in doing the Complaint Awards. My background is in complaints and claims, so it was quite interesting to give it a go. And the thing about these awards and being a judge is that it's a great opportunity to get out of your industry. It always fascinates me what people do for a living. And the different things that they come up with, the solutions, the challenges that they face. But do you know what? Some of them are very similar to the industry that you might be in. So I've actually learned an awful lot out of doing it. I note it down as a CPD, but I have a lot of fun doing them. The Complaints Awards this time, it was the first time for me. And it was great because I think my category was most improved complaint handling, and It was a small category, variety of different people, businesses, small, large. But what's great about some of these is that you do get the independence going. It's not just all about big corporates. But it's fascinating to see the challenges that people face and then how they address them. And what I always love about them most is just the passion that comes through when people say, do you know what? Things aren't great sometimes, but this is what we do about it. And this is how we're going to stop it happening in the future. And for me, it always sort of puts a real human touch behind the people who deal with complaints and claims. For many years, I actually didn't tell people what I did for a living. I used to just say I was in an office. I was office manager. Right. And that was because it was a bit difficult to explain to people. Because I'm a chartered surveyor, I work in the residential valuation sector. So your home buyers, building surveys, mortgage valuations, that kind of surveyor. And then about 10 or so years ago, I moved to a central head office role to do audits, and they had a complaint team of 3, and they said, oh, would you mind helping out? I then took that on, and it was great for me as a surveyor. Before I became a surveyor, I'd actually worked in call centres like BT, British Gas, that kind of thing. So I wasn't afraid to talk to someone on the phone, whereas a lot of surveyors or technical people are sometimes. So it's quite a natural thing for me to do. And that I then, it started with, queries, dissatisfaction to actually large negligence, defect and valuation claims. So it was a really interesting thing for me to involve in. But explaining to somebody what I did, they would always, are you a quantity surveyor? No, I'm not. I'm a different type of surveyor. And then have to explain that. And then they'd say, well, what's happening with the housing market? Should I buy or sell? And you never want to be asked that as a surveyor, which is a resist. And then when you give your opinion, they challenge you on it. And then when I used to say I dealt with complaints and claims, they would normally say, God, your job must be horrible being shouted at all day. And it wasn't at all. You know, when you're dealing with that kind of problem, it's very emotive. Yes, you have to have a lot of empathy, but you have to be really, really cool. You know, you have to really have that distance where you can show empathy, that you understand, but do you know what? There's a problem to be solved here. And this isn't just, you know, someone with a faulty product or a poor service that's gone wrong. This is people's homes. It's their lives. And that's big stuff. So and really that's where my customer experience journey started, because I had this huge team, which I grew to deal with all the complaints and claims. And I realized that actually complaint numbers were going down, but I was still, you know, in terms of what we were defending, but I was still getting lots of queries in and dissatisfactions and things. And so I started to look at, well, why are they coming to us? You know, if we're batting them away or defending them, or, you know, it's not a complaint as we would see it, why are they still coming to us? And that then took me on a journey of customer experience, of making sure people have the information that they need to make the decisions that they need to make, that the reports that we used to provide were useful and people knew what to do with it, that they knew who we were as a company. You know, one of the simplest things that people can do is a welcome. Welcome to our business. This is who we are and what we're going to do. I know you've just bought a product of us, but let me tell you again, welcome, and open up that opportunity so people can talk. And then just a real thank you for your business at the end. Thank you for spending that time with us, not just money. Thank you for that. And I started to see a real difference in then the kind of complaints that I would get in. You know, yes, mistakes happen sometimes, but they were what I would call cleaner complaints. You know, they were more straightforward. They weren't, and you did this, and there was a typo, and somebody didn't call, and etc. You know, people don't complain about just one thing. When they get very annoyed, they then get it all off their chest to the list of 28 different things. And we were able to really clear that out. But what that meant then was, when we dealt with complaints, yes, it was cleaner. It was easier to understand what the challenges were, what the problems were, how to resolve it. But you already had that expectation of good service, rather than, you know, a very angry, negative customer. So it's been an interesting journey for me. And the team that I had at the time, so initially I think at one point it was a team of 40, believe it or not, you know, some abroad as well. And we changed that around so that actually half the team were dealing with the problems and half the team were being really proactive, saying, talk to us. What is it you don't know? What can we help you with? And through that, we really refined some of our internal processes. So I left the corporate role just over a year ago now. And that's taken me on a different journey to get involved in all sorts of other stuff. But I'd recommend anybody going to have a go at judging. You do have to do a bit of work. It's not just sitting there all day. It's a bit of prep work where you have to review people's submissions. But it's a real insight to the way that other businesses and other people and other industries tackle some of the challenges that they've faced. And I love it.
When you're talking about the sort of complaints that are coming in, so that was, what type of thing was it coming in, and who was it you were feeding back to?
Yeah, so I worked for a large corporate firm of surveyors. I started my professional career as a surveyor down in Croydon. I'd inspect lots of properties for house purchase, remortgage for banks and house buyers. And the kind of problems that you then have are people who bought a property and you've moved in, and on day one, something doesn't work. Something's collapsed. There's a problem. And you would then be contacted to say, what, you know, oh my goodness, what's gone on? So it's that kind of thing. But there's a whole range of things from on the remortgage side, where you know, surveyor would value the property and the Daily Mail the next day would say house prices have gone up 10%. And then you'd get a phone call to say, well, the Daily Mail says the house prices have gone up, therefore my house should be valued more. So people's expectations of property value and what things are worth. You might get, things like conduct. The surveyor didn't talk to me. He didn't tell me what my house was worth. Well, he can't, because you're not the client. The bank is. So it's sometimes explaining some of that. There'd be the defects, ones that as I said, that would go wrong. And typically they would be either when someone's just moved in, and when the vendor has moved all their property out, all their furniture and things out, you then discover things that we couldn't have seen. Or sometimes a couple of months in, when people start decorating and they strip the wallpaper off and they see cracks or whatever. So they would then sort of stagger in. But then you get things like valuation claims, and that's typically where, say, a property's been repossessed, and the bank would then come to you as a surveyor to say, well, we've had to repossess the property. Now we look at it, we think you overvalued. And those are fortunately few and far between now. But, in 2007, 8, 9, 10, the surveying industry, sort of the property industry with the housing market crash, those were dark, dark days for surveyors. And we used to get what they call confetti letters, where solicitors would send you a notification of a claim just in case we might sue you in the future. We think there's a problem. And they came in their hundreds and thousands. And they were horrible times to deal with. Now, a lot of them were defended. A lot of surveyors were able to sort of negotiate those claims. And the practices that we had in the industry back then were lax. Record keeping wasn't great. Technology wasn't what it was. Now, 10 years on, things are much, much better. There's a much more robust way of recording your notes, understanding what the surveyor did, their opinion, and all of that really helps then when you go to defend a claim or to investigate a claim. There's nothing better than picking up a file with all the notes that you need. So at least you can, whether you defend it or not, you can at least understand what's gone on. So the industry has moved on quite a bit.
There's many different types of surveys, and from what I understand, there's quite a misunderstanding in the general public about the differences between all of them.
Oh gosh, there is, and we don't help ourselves at all. And as it happens at the moment, the RICS, the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, are looking at reviewing their home surveys offerings and how they expect surveyors to provide those services. So the RICS has their own licensed products, which is the home buyer survey and a building survey, which most people will be familiar with. And they're effectively a template for surveyors to use. But what they also say is, well, so long as you meet these standards and you carry out an inspection to these levels 1, 2, 3, you can do in whatever colour paper you want, whatever whistles and bells, as long as it meets these standards. And that makes it really confusing for a consumer to know if they're comparing like with like when they, compare services with a surveyor. And what's interesting right now at the moment is that the RICS are reviewing it, and you've got, I can think of 5 or 6 different products and services out there that are being tested and trialed in the market. Big lenders, just some of the bigger surveying panel firms, estate agents starting to work on some. And there's everything from, sort of a 17-point checklist on your home to a report that's full of photos. They're really trying to push the boundaries as to, well, what does a report look like for a consumer now buying a property? And when I was dealing with all of the claims and all of the problems, that's the kind of thing that I then looked at. Well, we've given you this report, but do you know why didn't you use it? Why didn't you get the advice that you needed? Because we said in the report you needed to get the dampness checked or speak to an engineer. Why didn't that happen? And what I discovered is that the reports that we send out, do you know what? On the whole, they are great. But some of them are full of caveats, very defensive reporting, because we've got this background of being sued. It all stops with the surveyor. The reports are very, very text heavy, jargon heavy. The reading age in the UK is 11.
Wow.
The reading age in the UK is 11, and that will get you through a Harry Potter book. Doesn't necessarily mean that you might be able to spell Voldemort or understand, some complex parts of the story, but you'll get the gist. And what I discovered was that we were sending out actually, sometimes really helpful reports, but people weren't using them. They didn't know how to digest them. When you get something sent through the post or on email, we all skip through and you want to get to the juicy parts that tells you what's wrong. And so there, for me, we're giving great advice. And even now, as I look at the different report types that are out there, there's still some great stuff in there, but it's refining it to make sure that it lands with that individual. So I started to look at what do different report types look like? Do we need to do more of a magazine feel rather than sort of this text heavy? Do we need to talk to customers more to make sure that they understand? And what we have in the industry really is this approach of being consistent. We have to consistently do our reports all the same. But what we fail to recognise is that individuals are all different, and so our service should recognise that consumers are consistently different. Yeah, so we need to marry the two, and there are lots of different ways that we can start to address that.
So so from what you've just been saying, and about 10 years ago when there was all the the bank collapses and the pressure that surveyors were having then, so how has it changed from that period to now? What is different about what a surveyor does and what a consumer receives?
So the main differences are the use of technology and, I suppose, standardizing what a surveyor does. So most surveyors will use software. Most people have heard of Rightmove, the website. Well, they have a surveyor's comparable tool that all the surveyors largely use to find the best comparable evidence and record it. So that's never been tested in courts yet, as far as I'm aware, but it's so much better than it used to be. We used to have a piece of paper and a highlighter pen, and say these three are the same, and from our knowledge. So the amount of the quality of that is much better. In terms of what a surveyor does actually out on site, there are different tools and things that have been used. So you'll see things like drones or 360 cameras or those sort of heat camera sensors. There's lots of different, there's apps even that can help you work out levels. So there's lots of different things that a surveyor can use, but it comes back down to, well, what would a reasonable surveyor do? Is it reasonable now for a surveyor to scour the internet for what's going on in a local area? In the past, we might have just looked at the local newspaper, and said, is there a new housing development in the back? We might have sort of contacted the local planning office or whatever. But is it reasonable now to go that far? And that's some of the challenges that the industry has. But there's a lot that we know about property now compared to 10, 20 years ago. And we know that from the likes of things like insurance claims, on subsidence, some of the big insurance companies, subsidence, they know all the postcodes where there's clay soil and it's more likely, or the flooding areas. And so in many ways, if we know that information before, then a surveyor should have, or a conveyancer even, should have all of that information up front. And 20 years ago, I did my dissertation. It's on a floppy disk somewhere in my loft, and I keep on threatening to go and find it, although I'll never be able to get the information off because I don't think anyone uses floppy disks anymore. But I did my dissertation on the Home Information Pack, which was a government initiative to have this seller's pack. So it had everything ready before you sold the house. And it didn't happen for lots of different reasons. Something similar actually happened in Scotland. And they've got the home report and single survey up there, and that works well. It's established. But in England and Wales, we didn't. And as I look at it now, 20 years on, with the technologies that we've got, with what we know about our properties and the landscape and how things lie, there's no reason why we can't have something like that now. And that actually helps people. There are lots of things, there are properties out there now that if the bank's hooked up with the estate agents and run it through an online system with data that we've got, it could be mortgage ready and pre-approved in principle as it was put on the market. So you don't then have to put it on the market, then the buyer then has to go and get the mortgage valuation later, and it sort of takes time. It could all be pre-approved. I mean, yes, there's things you need to check, don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of upfront stuff that we can do. And so I'm doing some work with a home buying and selling group, which is actually looking at how we bring the industry together, because what we do is we work in silo. We work on our own. So surveyors they inspect properties. We've got this challenge with, our reporting, which is starting to be addressed and things will change. But we don't always talk to, the estate agents or the conveyancers, or anybody else. And similarly, conveyancers do their thing. And what they will do is they'll get something will flag up and they'll get a report and it'll go to the bank and then it'll go to the surveyor who says, is this a problem in your opinion? And the surveyor says, I don't know, it's in black and white. It's not colour, and then it'll sort of send back. And, typically these things like environmental reports, it's in a flooding area. Does this affect your valuation? Is it okay? And a surveyor can't say it's okay unless it's outside of a lender's guidance and criteria. But they can say, well, it wasn't flooding when I was there, or they can consider sort of the impact, but they can't say yes, you should buy it, no, you shouldn't. And so across the industry, from the banks who have the technology to do things much, much better, and drive actually a lot of the house buying industry with their demands, from conveyancers who really need to up their skills in terms of technology, particularly a lot of these smaller firms, and to work better together. Surveyors who, in my view, aren't always very customer friendly. They're great people at inspecting property. They're not all great at talking to customers and understanding what a customer needs. You've got estate agents who, let's face it, actually get quite a lot of stick, and some of them aren't great. But do you know what? There are some brilliant estate agents out there, and they recognise that people want to move home. They don't want to go through a process, and there's some great estate agents out there. And then you've got people like, removal firms at the tail end who are part of that home buying process and journey. And I was talking to somebody, a removal guy recently, and he was telling me about how he had spent 3 hours, his customer had spent 3 hours sat in a car pub car park, waiting for the chain to complete. So what happens is, the bottom of the chain will complete, and the money then sort of gets ticked up and passed on. And there was a delay at the first one because the solicitor was in the meeting, and this sort of huge chain of about 5 or 6. And this lady was then left sort of sat in the car park. Is it going to happen today? Because of the whole sort of office hours and money transferring. And there's a couple of things. One, the banks could absolutely make that happen with one push of a button, so that all payments are made, all collect the chain and make all payments made at the same time, so that you don't have that delay. But there's a real human cost here for me. So this lady, it was an expensive house that she was buying. She sat in her car with her kids for a couple of hours. And actually, that gives a lot of uncertainty, because our homes are our safe places. Now, I know that there are people who live on the street and who can't afford homes and the challenges. But, for those people who have scraped up enough money to buy a property, it's a lot of pressure, it's a lot of stress, whether we got the money or not. And to sit in that car park and think, actually, have I got a home? Am I going to be living in a travel lodge tonight? What do I do with all this stuff? To actually the removal guys who have travelled, to do their job, and they can't get home until very late at night, and they can't see their kids and families. all because a solicitor at the start of the chain was in a meeting and couldn't approve some funds. There's a real human cost across the whole thing, not just for people buying houses, but also for people in the industry.
As you were speaking, I was wondering, are there any that you're aware of, any systems in other countries that work better than what we have?
There are pros and cons to them. There's lots of different models. The fact is, actually, I was listening to the news just yesterday, and the Chancellor was talking about we need to build new homes, and we're releasing some funding to build. I think it was 30,000 new homes, so we can get to our target. And at the same time, there was an article that came out in the Telegraph that talked about there's a 5% increase in the number of empty homes in the UK. Whether people have got second homes or they're vacant for whatever reason. And it's we tend to look at quick fixes. Oh, we need more houses because there's people are struggling, and there's a limit, or we should look at abroad, like what they do in Norway or in Denmark or Australia. Actually use an awful lot of technology, but they're different countries, or people are looking for quick fixes. And they talk about a broken housing market. And actually, it's not that broken, I don't think. It's just quite disorganised. And the problem with building new homes, in my view, and I used to work for a developer at one stage early on in my career, but the problem with building new homes is that, for me, it's a bit like giving sweets to a growing child. Now, you've got that euphoria of, ooh, sweets. But it tends to be short-lived, and you get that sugar rush, and you think it's great. But the fact is, if you eat too much sugar, you get long-term health problems. And the problem with new homes is that the quality isn't really great sometimes. We've got all these issues with the leasehold and the scandals that you'll have heard about, high-rise buildings, which they're building a lot of, and the cladding issues, the fire safety issues that we've got. So there's lots of issues, and it doesn't really get to the root of the problem, which for me is that actually we've got a legacy process in our country that needs to be improved, but it starts with talking to each other. These industries, the surveyors, the conveyancers, the estate agents, the banks, talking to each other to see what they can be done to improve. That's, for me, is the real key, because we're all concentrating on what we can do to improve our own customer experience and our businesses directly, but we're not looking either side of us. And from a consumer's point of view, yes, they might deal with lots of different professionals, but they're on one long journey, and that journey is the most expensive purchase they will probably ever buy. And we've got to think about that in that context.
A lot of people, especially when people are remortgaging, the whole kind of evaluation side of it is just kind of seen as a hurdle. They just want to get over as quick as possible. And so therefore, I wonder if people even look at the evaluation report that comes back.
Absolutely right. And there's a different view from the different banks and building societies as to whether they release the report to the customer or not. And as I understand it, that comes from the Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA's approach. They've got an initiative called Treating Customers Fairly, the TCF policy. And really, in its best terms, it's about consistency of service, making sure that everybody gets the right advice in the right way, consistently, the sort of a blanket approach. And when it's done well, it's not a bad thing. But not everybody in that home buying journey, as in the businesses and industries, are aligned to that or regulated by that. And the way that the lenders work is they will take a view as to, is it right, is it fair to the customer to release that report or not? So at the bank or a bank or lender, they are there to lend the money. Others take the view of, well, actually, we're a building society and we care a bit more, and it's all about you and your home, and we think it's right that you should have a copy of the report. So what you find is inconsistency, where some banks say, we're only doing the valuation, and they've had to refine the kind of information that they need for their lending criteria and really sort of strip it back and say, no, if you need property advice, evaluation is not a survey, you need to go and get it. Whereas others sort of go over and above, and their reports are almost as high quality, or actually they call it a valuation survey, and it's not a survey, it's a valuation for mortgage lending purposes. A survey is something different, and there's usually a direct contract between the consumer and the surveyor, not through the bank. So these banks and building societies are really confusing things for the consumers. What's interesting is that going forward, many banks won't provide the valuation report to the consumer, and they won't provide the valuation figure, because actually they'll just say, you wanted to borrow, you're remortgaging, you wanted to borrow an extra £20,000. Yes, it's approved. Because that's all they need to say. So the industry is really changing between those who want to go over and above and be helpful, and those that say, no, actually our remit is just to borrow money and make sure we're doing reasonable and sensible lending, but we advise them to get advice elsewhere. And that creates a real opportunity for surveyors to change the way that they work. But they need to start wearing their customer surveyor hat, not their valuer bank hat on. And that's when they need to start changing the way that they work. And that's the kind of thing that I'm now really committed to in my current role at BlueBox Partners, which is a small firm of surveyors that provides technical training and advice to surveyors. And we're really committed to helping them be better.
How do surveyors differ? So what is it that you can say to the people you're working with to help them give a better service to the people, to the consumers they're working for?
Well, for us, there are a few different ways of looking at the work that a surveyor does. So there's the usual CPD, the technical stuff, all the really juicy, boring stuff that everybody else hates, but surveyors love, the technical stuff, the stuff that they're really good at. But it's putting that into context as to, okay, so here's a CPD session on Japanese knotweed, which is all very interesting. But what does that mean for you when you report to a consumer? And what does a consumer do if there's Japanese knotweed? How can you be more helpful? And so for us, we really want to try and sort of put that into context, and for the surveyor to feel empowered with this information. But if they understand their customer, they can then translate it and use it in the right way. We're also looking at, actually how we help surveyors be better in business, and that sort of whole small business support, from everything from how to have a great LinkedIn profile to, systems and processes and tech within your business that can help you. Like any other small business, we also try and concentrate actually on well-being. Again, the stresses of when you work for yourself or for a small business, which most of us at BlueBox are. We've got our own businesses and things as well. It's really hard. It's really difficult. And sometimes, when you go out for the day, let's face it, sometimes the weather isn't great. It can be it's a tough job going out there. It's actually quite a physical job sometimes. But that whole sort of well-being piece is really important for us. And a couple of years ago, there was a couple of high-profile suicides of surveyors in our industry. And so mental health awareness is something that as an industry, we're really keen to raise awareness of. And then the other part really is building relationships and that customer experience. And that's where I come in. If surveyors knew that the average reading age in the UK was 11, they might think differently about how they write their reports. We write all of this content, technical content, but did you know actually you can get a copywriter to help you, rephrase some of these things, change the language that you use. Interestingly, I was at a conference that I presented just last week, and I talked about how women in the UK hold something like 85% of the purse of the buying decisions that are made in the UK. Either they go out and buy it, or they prod, the other half, the man, to go out and buy it. And actually, a couple of surveyors came up to me after and said, "Crikey, do you know what? I didn't realize most of my customers are actually women. The ones that I talk to are actually women. Initially, they might talk to the men, but it's women, and they've got to change their language in terms of understanding the needs of these women and what their priorities are. And just, the fact is, however you look at it, men and women are different. So sometimes just understanding that, and then really having that appreciation of the whole home buying and selling journey, so that you're not just, whilst you might have relationships with your estate agents or the conveyancer who might refer work, and you've got these sort of business relationships, what does it look like from a consumer's point of view? Do you know who their solicitor is or who the estate agent is? Do you know where they are in their training? What do you know about them? Are they a young family with young kids and they've got certain anxieties? Have they bought and sold 10 times before and they're not worried? But actually that makes them a bit more overconfident. Do they understand some of the pressures and things that are going on and understand it in that context?
Early on in the when we started recording, you were talking about the UK Complaint Handling Awards, and one of the things you mentioned was about the most improved category, and I'm baffled by that. So how would they determine how? So is this some company, like all different industries? I mean, how do they determine something like that?
So that category was all about really how they upped their game in their complaint handling. So there might have been a number of triggers where, they got a complaint from their own regulator, say, or they realised it was costing them more money on claims than they were in terms of bringing business in. A whole sort of raft of things that might cause a trigger. They might have been recruiting lots of staff, more staff to deal with complaints than sales, say. I don't know. So there was initially there's a trigger. But in that category, they were looking at what we used to do and what worked and what didn't, and what we do now, what the initiatives were. So it was for some of them, it was how they communicated with different departments. One of them, I think, had something, I don't know, 11 phone lines to get through to a complaints department or team. Sort of how they made a difference to gathering the information, their handling of it, importantly, how they empowered their people. And one of the key things in complaint handling is actually employee experience and empowering people to do the job. And that's something that I see a lot of in my industry. So when I had a complaints and claims team, I realised that they were dealing with some high value properties. And when I actually started to talk to them about, how do you feel this case is going and what do you think we should do? Is that whilst on paper, they could handle it and they were great. Some of these people are never going to buy and sell a house themselves. And that goes across the whole of the home buying and selling industry. So you've got people who will never be able to afford to buy their own home. Estate agent salaries aren't great. People who work in complaints departments, salaries aren't great. Unless you get to a certain level or you're professionally qualified with a specific task. It's the same as any other administrative type job, as poor as that sounds. And what I realised is that I really needed to work on helping them empathise and understand. So for me, my training for the team would then involve that, I wouldn't just go out with a surveyor for the day. They would go and visit an estate agent. They would understand and speak to, we had sessions with conveyancers as much as we could so they could understand the process. And then we got them to talk about, if they couldn't buy and sell a house, actually what was their experience of renting? Or perhaps their parent or a sibling or auntie or somebody was buying and selling a house. And really just to be aware of what was going on in the news. And just really to have that sort of, when you work in complaints, you've got to have empathy and understanding. But it's a big ask sometimes to put someone in that position. And that was the same in some of the, some of the people who were in the judging category. They didn't have the ailments or the financial issues or the challenges their customers had. And therefore it's a big ask to have somebody to have empathy. And that's very different to sympathy. Because empathy, yes, I hear you. This is what we're going to do about it together. rather than, oh, I'm so sorry that's happened. Oh, we can all be like that. There's empathy that actually means you understand, and you then work out a plan of what needs to be done to resolve it or to move it forward. So the most improved sort of category that I had was really, for me, is did they understand that? And it was the power of employee experience, which is customer experience just internally for me. What did they do and how did they invest? And some of them, brought in their frontline staff to talk about it. And that's when you really see the passion coming through.
As far as exceeding expectations is concerned, what are your thoughts on that?
Exceeding expectations, managing expectations, it sounds like something we should do. And I think people can really overthink it. There's a great quote that I always come back to by a American tennis player called Arthur Ashe from back in the 70s, I think it was. And he had a quote, and he said, "Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can." And that's, for me, where it starts. Whatever level you are in an organization or within your industry, you just start being a bit nicer. You just start being a bit kinder. And then you notice what makes a difference. And you talk to others about it, and you start to share experience. You then share case studies. I think they're really, really powerful, a powerful tool to show what's been done. Not on the old sort of marketing hype of, testimonials, that's different, but to really start to share. And then you start to use the power of your network. People don't realize the network that they have sometimes when, it's nothing better for me when you get a junior member of staff who comes to you or to another senior and flags something and says, "What do I do about this?" And you say, "What do you think?" And they know the answer. The claims teams, the customer experience teams, your frontline team, a lot of them know the answer. They've just never been asked. So use your network and use the people that are there, and do what you can. Sometimes, look at me. I'm all for changing the home buying and selling industry. That's massive. But you know what? You just do what you can. I'm not going to do it single-handedly. Crikey, I know that. But I know that there are bits that I can do that make a difference. And I know that talking about it makes a difference. And that's just where it starts.
Marion, I want to be respectful of your time. It's 42 minutes gone already. So if people want to find out more about you, where would they go?
So best place really would be to come and find me on LinkedIn or visit our website at blueboxpartners.com. Okay.
Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Marion. And I look forward to meeting you sometime.
Yeah, you too. Thanks very much.
Next week is episode 29 with James Nathan, who has a company called The James Nathan Experience. He also has a podcast called The James Nathan Show. James is a speaker. His past is in accountsman and recruitment, and he does many things now. As well as a speaker, he's a trainer and helps many different companies out. And some of the things that we talk about next week are why you shouldn't use satisfaction surveys, what the shop Lush can teach us, and why a waiter's job is not seen as a career here in the UK as it is in France. And we cover many, many more things as well. Hope you've enjoyed this week's show. Why not join the Facebook group Exceeding Expectations, share some insights about this episode or any other, ask some questions. And it would be great if you can maybe leave a review for the podcast on iTunes or any of the other podcast platforms. Hope you have a fantastic week and see you next week.